I'll make some verses just for fun, not about me, nor anyone, nor deeds that noble knights have done, nor love's ado. I made them riding in the sun. My horse helped too. When was I born? I cannot say. I am not sad. I am not fey. I am not stiff nor dégagé. What shall I do? Long since, enchanted by a fay, star-touched I grew. Dreaming for living I'll mistake, unless I'm told when I'm awake. My heart is sad and nigh to break with bitter rue, and I don't care 3 crumbs of cake, nor even 2. So ill am I that death I fear. Nothing know I but what I hear. I hope there is a doctor near, no matter who. If he can cure me, I'll pay dear. If not, he's through. I have a lady who or where I cannot tell you, but I swear she treats me neither ill nor fair. But I'm not blue, just so long as the Normans stay up there, out of Poitou. I have not seen, yet I adore this distant love. She sets no store on what I think, and furthermore, 'tis sad but true, others there are, some 3 or 4 I'm faithful to. I've made this verse, if you'll allow, I'll pass it on right now to someone who'll send it on somehow up to Anjou. He'd tell me what it means, I vow, if he but knew. Good evening, everyone, or good day, whenever you are listening to this. I have been telling a particular someone that I'd be getting to make this, and it's been a few days trying to get it done. It's been well over a week. One thing has interrupted another. Something came up, then something in which I did. I was like, I should have added this, or I should have added that. And now here we are, I hope, at the final cut. What in the world did I just read? Well, I read you A Song of Nothing. It was by William the Ninth of Aquitaine. Well, who was that? He's sometimes called the first troubadour. He certainly was among the first who has left us anything approaching the songbooks of the troubadours. That is, those wandering minstrels in the south of France in a region called Provençal, or, to put it in another way, Languedoc, or the land of Occitan. That was their language. It is closely related to French, though if you have Latin, it gives you an incredible segue into the language. And there are very few decent and good grammars. There are 1 or 2. And it is a language that if you are interested in medieval literature, you need to know. Now, among those who knew it was C.S. Lewis. Now, what's so special about the troubadours? What's going on with them? Why do I want to make a video about them? Well, A, I'm making a video about them because at the end of my last video, I said I would. And I am deeply interested in this topic. And it is a topic on which I've spent some hours, some lot of hours. And it's one that actually impacts us a lot. It impacts us a lot because of one word that has come down to us from that time that seems to have acquired, because of the troubadours, a completely different meaning than what it had before the troubadours. And this is one of the most fundamental words in our language. And I am talking about the language of all of Western Europe. And that is love. Love. Now, in a sense, going to C.S. Lewis, seeking his advice for this, of course, is the way to go. Why? Well, of course, he wrote that marvelous book, The Four Loves, and I shall have a chance to mention it later on, but more so because Lewis is one of the people who analyzed this change. And he talks about it, how it plays itself out in the language of literature going forward, European literature, the poetry of courtly love, that is, once it goes beyond the troubadours into northern France, and then eventually into Germany, into England. The cult of courtly love has nothing to do, for those of you who are older and get the reference, to courtly love, though actually maybe it does in ways that we don't want to think about. But Lewis basically breaks down what the troubadours did and how this then affects thinking about love. First, the cult of courtly love involves humility. All right, there are four things that he picks out. Four. Humility, all right, this is already in play when we're thinking about the knights of the Middle Ages, all right? They all vow obedience to their liege. In many ways, it's akin to the monastic obedience to the abbot. This is what, and humility demands a great deal of us when we have to obey, even though things seem to be other than what we think they should be, right? It takes humility. And it's humility not only to the Lord, but also to the lady, to Mesdames, right? Which actually means master, but it's used of the lady of my affections. Oftentimes, the mistress of the manor. Sometimes her lady in waiting, or ladies in waiting. We see it first used as master, meaning the master of my affections, Mesdames, by William IX, who's writing at the end of the 11th century and into the 12th century. Humility. The next is courtesy. All of these rituals that are lined up, right, that are in a way the rules to play the game, all right? Courtesy. And courtesy is an incredibly important thing. Why? Because if you think about it, it is actually the rules by which inferiors react to superiors, and then the obligations of superiors to inferiors, right? So this is courtesy. The next two are where, as it were, the rubber hits the road. Key to courtly love is adultery. Adultery. Andreas Capellanus makes the point. Andreas Capellanus was kind of the minstrel at the court of Marie of France, and we shall talk about her in a moment. Andreas Capellanus makes the point there can be no love without jealousy. And he goes on to make the point there can be no love in marriage. Now he's arguing this with a woman who's arguing against him. She's actually arguing, let us say, consonant with the faith of a Christian. And he is basically arguing consonant with the faith of a lover. And for him, unless there is secretive, unless there is the chase, unless there is the notion that love can be unfulfilled, there can be no love, right? What has happened? We see in this, right, part of the transformation of love. Humility, courtesy, as they go from the knight to his lord, that's all very proper. In a sense, it's proper to the lady, but ultimately, the knight is actually to have no relationships with the lady. But now, right, the quest for the unobtainable rose takes place. And of course, in this adultery, right, it is the breaking of bonds. It is the breaking of the bond between knight and liege, the breaking of bonds of fidelity to the sacrament, right? And all of this then revolves around what is called the religion of love, right? By which all things are reinterpreted. Allegory becomes an immense part in all that goes on in literature. Now, not all literature is completely besotted by this, but so much of it is. And indeed, in William the Ninth, 9 of his poems have come down to us. 9 of his songs have come down to us. We know that he abandoned his wife for the wife of one of his underlings. We know that he basically abandons his son, who becomes his successor, William X. We think, according to an early life, he carried on multiple love affairs, and his songs are about sexual exploits. And the troubadour poetry, it is not comporting with what we think should be said or sung or done by medieval knights. In some ways, chivalry, as we end up getting it, and we see it in other places, the Song of Roland, is an attempt to, let us say, bring about a minimizing of the cult of courtly love. William is succeeded by his son, William, through his first marriage. William himself, William X of Aquitaine, dies in 1137. He leaves his 15-year-old daughter in the hand of Louis VI of France. Louis the Fat, he's sometimes called. One of the more able kings of France. Basically is one of the ones responsible for kind of bringing France from, or the king of France from being this, well, semi-powerful member of the nobility, actually into more, let us say, regal splendor. Not that there was a lot of regal splendor about the court of France, but Louis the Fat, Louis VI, has the good sense to marry Eleanor to his son, who becomes Louis VII. Eleanor and Louis VII, by the time that Eleanor is 25, have no male heirs. And it seems that Eleanor is convinced that if she take her husband or convince her husband to go on crusade, this will then, as it were, propitiate the Lord to give them a male heir. Louis VII does something stupid where he ends up killing a number of his subjects. And of course, between this and between Eleanor's entreaties and between the preaching of St. Bernard, and of course, given the fact that Edessa, the northernmost of the Crusader principalities, had fallen in 1145, they go on crusade. Eleanor seemingly misbehaves herself with her uncle in Antioch. It's not clear. But be that as it may, by the 1150s, their marriage is dissolved. Eleanor, consequently, ends up marrying Henry II. Henry, who is the Duke of Normandy, the Count of Anjou, the Count of Poitou, now by his marriage to Eleanor, becomes the Duke of Aquitaine. Oh, he's also the Count of Maine. And, he's also the King of England, right? So here's the King of England, who, as a vassal of Louis VII, actually has more possessions in France than Louis does, right? And this is what's called the Angevin Empire, Angevin as the adjective of Anjou. I bring all this up for this simple reason. Eleanor, as the granddaughter of William IX, seemingly was very influenced by her grandfather, if we can take the whole episode with her uncle as a reality. And Eleanor, through Louis VII, that had a daughter named Marie, who becomes known as Marie of France. Eleanor, through Henry II, has 3 sons. And the eldest dies. The second then becomes King of England, Duke of Normandy, Duke of Aquitaine, Count of Anjou, Count of Maine, right? In 1189. And he is someone who's completely given to all these things, the court of love, the religion of love, and that is Richard the Lionheart. And Richard, of course, is one of the great knights of the Middle Ages. He ends up dying in battle. And Richard, with his mom, is very influential in spreading the cult of courtly love in England. Marie de France, well, throughout France. And so when we look at this, all right, this becomes a spreading of this notion of courtly love, this changing of the notion of what is love, right? And so perhaps I should say something just a bit more about that, because everybody's going to say, well, you know, not everybody in the past thought that adultery was a great thing. Very few people back in the past thought adultery was a great thing. Well, this is where things have changed. It's in this. Love becomes a passion, and indeed we could almost say a sentimental passion, or even a passionate sentiment that makes demands upon us that we must fulfill, right? The God of love, right? And it is something that when it comes upon us, we cannot help but act. We cannot help but act, right? I mean, I put this question to my students so often. Can you really help who you fell in love with? And all of them fall into this like, oh no, right? That is, if they actually admit that they've fallen in love. Oh, I could not have helped it. There's no way around it. Oh, prior to the Troubadours, nobody would have ever said that. No one would have said that. All right. Now, seeing this change in sentiment was something most historians, and Lewis is basically writing saying, well, this is all known. What is it? What does it mean? What are the implications for literature, for the allegorical poetry that follows, right, throughout European literature? And one of the persons who took it further was Roger Scruton. Now, Scruton basically is picked up with the Tristan story. Now, Tristan was a story from England, Tristan and Isolde. The earliest version, Varro, or one of the earlier versions, is incomplete. We do have some completed versions later, but what he is picking up on, what Roger Scruton is picking up on, is the Tristan and Isolde of Gottfried of Strasbourg. And in this story, this is where he picks up why. Well, he picks it up because of Scruton's love for Wagner. Now, love for Wagner in the sense of an intellectual pursuit. Why? Because Wagner was brilliant. Wagner not only was brilliant as a composer, in his librettos, in his music and diction, but he also knew the philosophers of his day. He had read them. He had read Hegel. He had read Kant. And indeed, and this is one of the things that Scruton points out, to look at Wagner's work, particularly Tristan and Isolde, is to see Kant in action, and Kant's basic dictum, thou shalt not use people as means to your own end, or means to any end. Thou shalt use people as ends in themselves. This is the basic point, all right? And he develops all of this in his book, Death Devoted Heart, all right, Philosophy and Religion in Wagner, looking at Tristan and Isolde and talking about how in them they realize that they exist for each other. And I will tell you, it is not a simple book. I mean, you've got to know your philosophy. And on top of that, you need to know music, because Scruton knew all of that. Scruton was a very good philosopher. He knew music really, really well. And I mean, he composed. And on top of that, he was, in his particular field, he was brilliant as a modern philosopher. And if you don't have time to read Death Devoted Heart, or you don't know music, because then almost like a third of the book is then kind of lost on you and what he's doing if you don't know anything about music. If you know a little bit about music, then you can benefit from it. But go through it. One of the places then to go is if you look up, I think it's called Philosophical Conversations. With Sarah Leslie. It might be Sarah Jean Leslie or Sarah Beth Leslie. I will put the link underneath, right? Underneath, there will be a link. She interviews Scruton about this very question. It is a wonderful conversation. And it was this conversation that said, I need to go buy Death Devoted Heart. So I did. And, but in it, right, the whole point about Death Devoted Heart, all right, death in Scruton becomes the proper resolution of the love, right? The love of a dying thing must mean that I myself must also be dying. Scruton actually rejects Lewis, not on the question of allegory, which he thinks he's absolutely right. He rejects Lewis on the question about the baseness of courtly love. To him, Scruton kind of conflates courtly love and chivalry. That what's really going on is kind of a Christianizing of these old pagan martial enterprises. And in the case of chivalry, I would say he's right. Now, he sees love among the troubadours as an act of the will. But for almost all the troubadours, this is not the case at all. The god of love overcomes us. Or, as in the case of the early Tristan and Isolde, they're overcome by a potion and they can't help themselves. And this gets back to the thing. Can I help who I fall in love with? Right? After the troubadours? Why, of course, no. Right? The fateful gaze, right? So, in Scruton, death is the resolution of love of dying things for other dying things. In the troubadours, it is the only proper end of the sentimental passion or the passion sentiment. Why? Because earthly love is always a frustration. Even if fulfilled, it is still a frustration. In a sense, it's like those old Chesterfield cigarette commercials. They satisfy. Apparently, they only satisfy for like 15 or 20 minutes before you need another Chesterfield cigarette. Scruton purposely goes out of his way to disagree, not so much with Lewis, but instead with Denis de Rougemont. So de Rougemont wrote a book, L'amour et l'Occident, Love and the West. It is a marvelous book. It is a marvelous book. Now, for those of you who are out there going, well, that might be a marvelous book, but it's closed to me. Well, good news. It was translated. And it was translated and pretty much overseen by de Rougemont too, here called Love in the Western World. And it is really good. It is a long read. And the interesting thing is that Scruton accuses de Rougemont of giving in to being a Freudian, of seeing Eros, all right, as some sort of counterpart to Thanos. Now, there is an interplay in Freud between Eros and Thanos, And the best place to look this up, I mean, there's all sorts of places for you to look this up, but if you look at Civilization's Discontents, right? At the end of it, Freud pits Eros against Thanos, all right, or against Thanatos. Death, love and death. And to Freud, the death instinct is that instinct which is the one which tells us to act without thinking about consequences, right? This is ever the action of the adulteress and the adulterer. They act thinking without the consequences of what they're doing. I mean, maybe their thoughts would give them some pause about it, right? So this is in Freud. The Thanatos impulse is constantly suppressed because it's destructive. Eros, on the other hand, well, it's kind of like the distinction in Nietzsche between Apollo and Bacchus, or Apollo and Dionysus, Bacchus and Dionysus being one and the same. Bacchus and Dionysus are always at knives' ends with Apollo. Why? Because Apollo is the god of the contrived. Bacchus is the god of the will to life. Well, in Freud, Thanatos is much like Bacchus Dionysus in Nietzsche. That is, it's the constant will to life, the will to action, whereas Eros is kind of the reality principle. What is the reality principle? That's the principle that says, I can't eat ice cream every night unless I burn off 500 or 600 calories every night as well. I can't eat ice cream every night. So with that in mind, every time I go by the freezer, I open it up and I see the ice cream, I have to close it. Why? Because I don't want to put on weight, I don't, right? And of course, for Freud, we're not talking about ice cream, we're talking about sex, right? And so this is Eros. It's the reality principle that basically says, I need to deal with my consequences, all right? And in Denis de Rougemont, what is going on? This is what's going on. For de Rougemont, the troubadours changed all their thinking, or the origin of their thinking about love is seated in the situation of the religious life of southern France at that time. Now, Lewis talks about this change. Where does it come from? He asks, does it come from Christianity? No, it does not. And in some ways, Christianity and the fealty to the Virgin, which emerges in the late 11th century and the beginning of the 12th century in Anselm, and then especially in Bernard of Clairvaux and in many, many others, is in many ways a response to courtly love. Scruton, on the other hand, sees them kind of playing a part with each other. De Rougemont doesn't buy that at all. De Rougemont basically says the origins of this idea that has changed love from a studied commitment of dying to myself, that I might live for the benefit of the others. Where does it arise from? That's the Christian point. De Rougemont's quite clear about this. I mean, anyone who could think that de Rougemont is somehow, I mean, maybe he is touched by Freud, since that everybody's touched by Freud. But de Rougemont makes a point that in Christianity, death is not the end or the goal of my mortal existence. In a sense, the beginning of my true mortal existence is death. When I take up my cross, I die to myself and I follow Christ. Right? De Rougemont's explicitly clear about this. No, what's he getting at? I'm kind of beating around the bush here. All right? This change that love becomes a sentiment, love becomes a feeling, right? Love becomes this all-encompassing thing. And by this, I mean romantic love. This all comes because ultimately the troubadours were not Christians. This is de Rougemont's point. Well, what were they? His point is that they were all dualist Manichaean heretics. And their songs are rife with the thought of the Manichaeism, of the Cathars, or we could say of the Albigensians. Well, who in the world were the Cathars? Who were the Albigensians? Well, there are any number of books written on that, and I have a number of them sitting here at hands at ready. And of course, probably the best book on these really is Malcolm Barber, The Cathars, the Duelist Heretics in Languedoc in the High Middle Ages. The Cathars, right, permeated southern France. They ended up murdering a papal legate, which then therefore called for a crusade. All right, so the murder of this legate occurs in 1208, and it ended up resulting in a crusade. And so many books have been written on this. Jonathan Sumption is a very good book, right? The Albigensian Crusade. They were called the Albigensians as well. And then Heresy Crusade and Inquisition in Southern France, 1100 to 1250, by Walter Wakefield. And Wakefield has done an excellent job on this. Why? Because Wakefield put his hand to the plow, right? And with Austin Evans, you can see the size of this book. This is in Columbia's Records of Western Civilization series. They have a lot of good books in this. I mean, a lot. Heresies of the High Middle Ages. About a half of this book is devoted to the Cathars. All right. And, you know, including a book I would give to my students by a fellow named Bernard of Guy, or Bernard Guy. And Bernard Guy wrote this book. He was an inquisitor about how to trap and trick the Cathars into confessing who they are, right? Bernardo Guy. And if you, for those of you who know, he appears in Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. In the movie, he's played by F. Murray Abraham, right? As the Inquisitor who comes and basically condemns the girl to death. And so it's a it's a high dramatic movie, right? And it's a very good book. Sean Connery is in it. And so The Name of the Rose. And of course, all of this, of course, is a play on the whole idea of courtly love and the pursuit of the rose. And the movie's complex. The book is very complex. It is really complex, and I highly commend it. But what do the Cathars have to do with the Troubadours? How did all these duelists end up in southern France? Well, and I would just recommend one more book. I mean, I have a number of books sitting here that I could recommend, particularly books, larger books on heresy in the High Middle Ages. That I recommend, right? But Yuri Stoyanov, the other God, right? Because if they're dualist, they believe in two equally ultimate principles, a good God and an evil God. And it's interesting, of course, this is kind of what actually comes out in Freud, right? Immortal Thanos and immortal Eros are locked in battle, all right? So this is very good on their theology, their thought, a bit of their history. Of course, Malcolm Lambert, Medieval Heresy. It's well worth it. I'm sorry if I'm filling up your bibliography for those of you who are taking notes, but one last book that I shall mention here before getting to the one you should look at, of course, is Gordon Leff. Gordon Leff is a brilliant intellectual historian. His short book, The Dissolution of the Medieval Outlook on the Collapse of Realism in the Light of Nominalism, is just so good, right? The Dissolution of the Medieval Outlook, Heresy of the Latter Middle Ages, Gordon Leff. Really a careful and a good scholar. He began his life in the academy as a Marxist and ultimately came and repudiated Marxism. This is before the fall of the Berlin Wall. But the book to look at Why? Because it's readable, it's accessible, and it's a good read, because everything this man writes is a good read. Not that I agree with everything this man writes, far from it. But it's Sir Stephen Runciman, the medieval Manichaean. And Runciman traces the history from the earliest times up through the Paulicians, all right, who were these duelists who lived on the edge of the Byzantine Empire. They allied themselves with the Muslims until Basil I went and sacked their fortress of Tefrike, which is over towards the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. He goes, he sacks their city. He then imports all these people and settles them in Macedonia. There actually, for a time, was a theme called the Theme of the Manichees. We meet these people again in the Alexiad of Anna Komnena. And we meet them especially because there was a Bogomil missionary. Right, we meet them in Anna Komnena as the Bogomils. All right. And there was a Bogomil missionary who tries to convert the Emperor Alexius Komnenos. All right. But from the Bogomils in Bulgaria, all right, they travel along the trade routes. They are already in northern Italy by the time this Bogomil missionary tries to convert Alexius Komnenos. They're already in northern Italy. They are already in southern France, in Languedoc, in Provençal. And Runciman traces all this out. I will note there's a very good study of the Bogomils by Dmitry Obolensky. Prince Obolensky taught at Oxford, and he's buried in Wolvercote Cemetery, where Tolkien is buried. And he actually shares a grave with Mary Tolstoy, all right? And so Obolensky wrote a very good book on the Bogomils, which basically far surpasses Runciman's treatment of the Bogomils. But Runciman's benefit is that he traces the course of this heresy to the south of France, all right? They were duelists. The evil god has trapped elements of the good god and of the good god's pantheon, for lack of a better term, it's not correctly so, in our bodies, right? The only way that we can be free is to be free by death in a purified state, all right? Human love, human activities, the body itself is of secondary importance, all right? This is what de Rougemont picks up on about death as the ultimate resolution of our passion, right? Because this demon has overcome us and there is no escape from it. And de Rougemont is really quite good. He then kind of traces the history on through. He seemingly has absolutely no knowledge of Lewis's book because he puts his book together in France, kind of at the same time. I mean, he publishes a few years after Lewis, but regardless, these are who the Cathars are. These are who the Troubadours are. The Troubadours make a cult of passion, of love as this affection, right? Instead of affection as an affection, right? This is Lewis's point in the Four Loves. Eros is that love between husband and a wife. It is the proper love between a husband and a wife. Venus is the abasement, the decadence, and the depravity of what Eros should be. All right? Affection is a love of a parent to a child, a brother to a sister, a nephew to an uncle. Friendship is often thought of by the ancients as a higher, more noble form of love, often than Eros, because Eros is about duty and familial obligation, same as affection. Friendship, however, is something entered into willingly, right? Because someone has an interest that we also have. An interest to pursue the truth, an interest in mathematics, an interest in hunting or fishing, right? Lewis goes through all this. It's really a very good read. Of course, friendship takes a back seat, as do all of them, to charity, right? That love by which we love, expecting nothing in return, all right? Now, when we get to the Middle Ages, we find Dante. Dante at one time had been very much influenced by the troubadours. But by the time he writes Vita Nuova, he has shifted. And we can see this very much in the Divine Comedy, where he comes to realize he has loved wrongly. Not only had he loved Beatrice wrongly, he had loved those whom he had consorted with wrongly. And Beatrice makes the point to him, when I died, you could have loved me as you ought to have loved me. Instead, you neglected me. So here we have this this wonderful piece. And of course, when he finally gets to the summit of heaven, Beatrice fades in the background and he's guided by Bernard of Clairvaux, who's sometimes thought of as the doctor of the Christian doctrine of love. And Bernard is very brilliant on love. At some point, maybe I'll talk about his views about love. They're marvelous. They're really good. And I can say that even as an Orthodox. All right, even as an Orthodox, I could look at what Bernard says about love and how he breaks it down, thinks about it, to be commendable. And so when Dante reaches the highest peaks, he comes to realize that there is a love that moves the planets, right, and other stars. That the love of God rightly orders the world and should be ordering our own affections, ordering our own loves. If God's love orders the planet, then it certainly should be ordering us. And rightly ordered love, right? Now Dante has become the Augustinian, right? Get rid of love as a source of now an abused love and a misused love as a means by which I can dominate, right? The desire for power, libido dominante. All right. We see the troubadours also rebuked in the person of Christine de Pizan, the first woman we ever have met who writes for a living. Her husband had died, and then her dad dies. So instead of shoving her daughters, herself, and her mother into a convent, she decides she's going to write. And she makes a living for herself. And one of the things that happens is that there is a debate. And the debate is called the debate of the rose, meaning having to do with the very long and very allegorical poem, The Romance of the Rose. And basically, Christine was asked, well, what do you think about the merits of The Romance of the Rose? And Christine is like, this is horrible. This is horrible. Who thinks of his sister or his mother or his wife or his daughter? Do you guys think this way? And she wrote a letter to Cupid, a letter to the god of love, complaining in these terms. Is this what men, these writers think? Not men, these writers think. It ends up involving Jean Guerson, who is the rector of the University of Paris, who basically comes down with a heavy hand on Gontier Cole, one of Christine's interlocutors, threatening ecclesiastical censure for the things that Cole was saying. These men were defending adultery, all right? And perhaps then the place where this comes out, we could say almost the most, I don't say the most perfectly. That's not the right word, but we could say the most clearly is in Faust, right? It's in Faust. Now, most of us will know Faust, of course, from Faust. I'm sorry, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. It comes out in Goethe, not in Faust. It does not come out in Faust. Faust on the brain. Why? Because that's how most of us know Goethe, from Goethe's Faust. All right? And for those of you who have read Everyday Saints, there's a whole episode in there, the chapter on the Black Poodle. right? The chapter on the black poodle has to do with Faust. Mainly, it has to do with Mephistopheles, who you can actually look up. There are all sorts of sculptures of Mephistopheles that you can get for your home. That is, if you want to be the plaything of demons, go ahead. I don't recommend it, right? But in Goethe's Faust, right, here's a man who's become weary of life because he's become weary of the pursuit of knowledge, right? I'm not going to give it away. It is a book. Goethe's Faust was in German, now of course translated. It's 12,000 lines long, about a man who sold his soul to the devil. And in it, of course, we have the introduction. We meet this devil, Mephistopheles. And, of course, Mephistopheles first appears in what is called the Faust book, a German book published in Frankfurt, sold at the Frankfurt Book Fair in 1587. And that's where Mephistopheles appears. It becomes the basis for Christopher Marlowe's Faust, where Mephistopheles becomes Mephistopheles. But still, this demon who basically works out the deal between Faust and the devil, that if the devil can bring him any satisfaction in life, which of course Faust has completely said he will never have, then the devil would own his soul. And so he brings him everything, and nothing sates Faust. Something does sate him at the end of the book. That's all I'm going to say, right? Because the end of the book, well, is the end of the book. And I'm not here giving things away. If you need to have it given away, go look up Wikipedia. But no, the real point about Goethe is his book, The Sorrows of Young Werther, which he started and completed before Faust. And in it, what do we have? We have the very embodiment of William the Ninth, all right? When I was born, I cannot say. I am not sad, I am not fey, I am not stiff nor dégagé. What shall I do? Long since enchanted by a fay, star-touched I grew. In other words, a fairy has entered into my life. The fay. A fairy has entered into my life. And now the star, or the stars, are guiding me. Werther, even though astrology is never mentioned, the whole idea of astrology, which many people accepted. I mean, Philip Melanchthon, who was Luther's second in command at Wittenberg, was mad keen on following astrology and having the stars read, all right? And the thing is that the original Faust, who actually existed, all right, Georg Faust, he actually existed. He was a German astronomer. He may have had some medical training. Perhaps at some point I'll actually give a talk on Faust. I better keep my tongue because then I'm going to be asked for it. Faust was somebody who read the stars. Faust was someone who, it seems, because this was basically given testimony to by a Franciscan who had met Faust later in his life, where Faust says, I sold my soul to the devil, I am beyond redemption. All right? That is, Faust has no will. So whether it is Mephistopheles the demon or some fairy, we have no will. This is what's guiding us as we have this quest for the unknown woman, right? Far from the unknown God, it's become the unknown woman. And in the sorrows of young Werther, right? Werther, having just had a breakup with some girl, meets another girl. And of course, everything falls apart. He is warned. Oh, you're going to this party tonight. They'll be dancing. You'll meet Lotta. Be careful about Lotta, right? And of course, he meets Lotta. And they are dancing, right? This big promenade dance, that goes into squares and they separate and come back. And at one point they're together dancing, and some woman wags her finger at Lota. Albert, Albert, she says. Who is Albert? I asked, if I may be so bold as to inquire. Werther. Lota was about to reply when we had to separate to do the figure eight, and I thought I could detect a certain reflectiveness in her features when our paths crossed again. Why shouldn't you know? She said as she gave me her hand for the promenade. Albert is a good man. And I suppose you might say I am engaged to him. I suppose you might say I'm engaged to him. It's like a double subjunctive sentence, right? And this, of course, now means that Werther is trapped. He's trapped. And of course, the point is not that Werther's trapped. Werther is a man who's completely in tune with the world around him. The waterfalls, the trees, the young children, the birds. Lota, on the other hand, is part of the bourgeoisie. She's a completely plastic individual. This goes back to Nietzsche and Apollo, right? She's the completely plastic individual. She's not someone who's living life as it should be led, like Werther is. She's not leading life as it should be led. And what's more, she's now getting ready to enter into that worst and most plastic of all things, an arranged bourgeois marriage to Albert. Why is she marrying Albert? Because as her mother lay dying, her mother took Lota's hands, Lota is short for Charlotte, Lota's hands and Albert's, they placed them in each other and said, you're to marry each other. Of course, everybody's looking at, that's romance, that's courtship. Right, that's the point. That's the point. Werther is someone who has stayed true to what the natural order of things is, right? And his sentiments about love and about nature. And again, I could go on with the book, but it's all there for you to read. Whatever you do, don't look it up on Wikipedia to find out what happens. Read the stinking book, right? And so this is why I want to talk about the troubadours. And because the troubadours have very much affected us and our views of love. Love should involve tenderness. Love should involve affection. Love should involve sacrifice for the other, most of all right? But love ultimately is an obligation. Love at times is going to be difficult. Love at times is going to ask us to, well, love isn't, but the situation that we are in with our beloved will seemingly say, couldn't you live an easier life somewhere else? Easy compared to what? Easy compared to what? And so love in the ancient world was a commitment. All right? Love was a commitment. That's the first thing. Love is an act of will. All right? And this, I completely agree with Scruton. Love is an act of will. Now, he's writing this in relationship to Schopenhauer's notion of will. Or I should say, he's talking about Kant and Wagner in relationship to Schopenhauer. All right? But Scruton would still say, now Scruton was someone who was very much a Christian. And almost anything you can find by Sir Roger is worth the time. And if you have the time, there's this wonderful debate between him and Terry Eagleton. Right? It's on YouTube. It's quite good and it's quite entertaining. But yes, so Scruton and Scruton was of course a brilliant guy, and I fear and tremble to contradict him or to contradict Lewis or de Rougemont, right? But they're all three kind of contradicting each other, and I'm just trying to kind of wend my way between them. Perhaps tomorrow I'll reread Death Devoted Heart and think, I might be more inclined to agree with Scruton today than I do with de Rougemont. But today I agree with de Rougemont. He gives us what Lewis says can't be given. That is the basis for the troubadour thought, that love is a passion and a sentiment closely related to physical sexual love, the only proper result and resolving of this is death. All right? To die for love. All right? And this is one of the reasons that we can easily see why so much love in modern popular tripe is nihilistic. And perhaps someday I'll talk about that too. But I hate modern popular tripe, so I really don't want to talk about it. Any of you could talk about it, right? Most of you probably know more about modern literature than I do. I know very little, unless it's by Walker Percy and, to some extent, Flannery O'Connor. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Otherwise, or Deacon Nicholas Kotar, Where Love is Properly Ordered, as it is in Percy and Flannery O'Connor when they're talking about it. All right. So that is where we are. I hope that you have benefited from this. And of course, you can come see me on my webpage, which will be up soon. I'm not telling you what it is, but right, you can go visit my Patreon page, which I'm not giving out that yet either. That should be in the link shortly, as well as the Buy Me a Coffee page, which I will direct you to in the links. Anyway, I pray that you all have a blessed day and a blessed night. And anyway, that is the end of our endeavor.